The journey begins. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting its final golden rays across an endless stretch of asphalt. The faint hum of crickets mixed with the sound of a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. Michelle Thompson adjusted the strap of her duffel bag and looked around the empty parking lot of a small roadside diner. She had just finished a quick meal, a simple plate of eggs and toast, and now prepared to continue her journey across the country. Michelle, a former Marine turned self-defense instructor, had embarked on this journey to honor her late father. Her father, a civil rights activist, had spent his life fighting for justice and equality. His strength and resilience had shaped her own, and now she felt it was her duty to carry his legacy forward. This trip wasn't just about covering miles, it was about revisiting the landmarks of his battles, reconnecting with the past, and finding new meaning in her present. Her destination tonight was a small motel 2 towns over, a quiet and unassuming place where she could rest and prepare for the next leg of her journey. The road stretched before her, dark and endless, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of a streetlight. Michelle wasn't worried. She was no stranger to solitude, and the stillness of the highway felt almost meditative. As she approached her car, parked under the solitary glow of a flickering streetlight, her instincts suddenly sharpened. She paused with her hand on the door handle, her senses alert. In the distance, she heard it, a faint rumble, growing louder. Motorcycles. Michelle turned her head, scanning the horizon. The sound was unmistakable now, a chorus of engines reverberating through the night. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, but her expression remained calm, her body poised and ready. Years of military training had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her trouble was coming. The motorcycles grew closer, their headlights piercing through the darkness like twin beams of menace. Michelle's grip on the door tightened, but she didn't move. Instead, she stood her ground, her sharp eyes assessing the situation. As the first bike roared into view, followed closely by several others, Michelle exhaled slowly. The riders were part of a notorious group known as the Iron Vultures, infamous in small towns and highways for their violence and intimidation. They ruled the roads like modern-day marauders. Led by a man known only as Crusher, the Iron Vultures left destruction in their wake wherever they went. And tonight, they had set their sights on Michelle. As the bikes formed a loose circle around her car, Michelle observed them silently. The riders dismounted, their boots crunching on the gravel. Crusher, a towering man with a shaved head and tattoos snaking up his neck, stepped forward. His smirk was filled with arrogance, his presence oozing menace. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry over the rumbling engines. "What do we have here? The little lady out all alone. Doesn't seem safe, does it, boys?" The others laughed, a chorus of jeers and taunts that echoed in the still night. One of them, emboldened by their leader, added, "Maybe she needs some company. Wouldn't want her getting lonely." Michelle said nothing. She straightened her posture, her calm demeanor an unsettling contrast to the gang's aggression. Her silence wasn't fear, it was calculation. She was reading their movements, their body language, their positioning. Crusher noticed her lack of reaction and stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You don't talk much, do you?" he said, tilting his head mockingly. "Or maybe you're just too scared." Michelle finally spoke, her voice steady and firm. "I don't want any trouble. Just let me get in my car and go." Crusher laughed, a deep guttural sound that sent shivers through the air. "Trouble? Sweetheart, you don't get to decide that. You're on our road now." The gang cheered, their voices filled with malice. Michelle remained unfazed. Her training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, to never let the enemy see her sweat. She scanned the group, noting the positions of each rider, the weapons they carried, and the distance to her car. Every detail was cataloged and stored in her mind. Crusher leaned in closer, his grin widening. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue. Or maybe you think you're too good for us." Michelle met his gaze, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "I think you're making a mistake." The laughter died down. Crusher's grin faltered for a split second before returning, but Michelle had seen it. A flicker of doubt. "A mistake," he repeated, his tone mocking. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much out here." Michelle didn't respond. Instead, she stepped back, her hand moving subtly toward her duffel bag, which rested on the roof of her car. Inside was her personal safety kit, a collection of tools she always kept close, but she didn't reach for it yet. She wanted to give them a chance, a way out before things escalated. "Last warning," she said, her voice low but firm. "Walk away." Crusher's eyes narrowed, his pride stung by her defiance. He raised his hand, signaling to one of the gang members. The man stepped forward, a switchblade glinting in his hand under the dim light. "Let's see if she can back up that mouth," he sneered. The man lunged, the blade slicing through the air toward Michelle. But she was faster. In one fluid motion, she sidestepped, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground as the man cried out in pain. Before he could react, Michelle delivered a swift kick to his knee, sending him crumpling to the ground. The gang froze, their jeers replaced by stunned silence. Crusher's smirk disappeared, replaced by a scowl. Michelle stood over the fallen man, her stance calm and composed. She glanced up at the others, her expression unyielding. "I warned you," she said, her voice steady. Crusher stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You've got some nerve," he growled. "But you're outnumbered. Let's see how tough you really are." Michelle adjusted her stance, her eyes locked on Crusher. The tension crackled in the air, the stillness of the night broken only by the distant hum of crickets. She wasn't afraid. She had faced worse odds before and come out on top. Tonight would be no different. As the gang prepared to attack, Michelle tightened her resolve. This wasn't just about survival. It was about sending a message. For every person who had been targeted, for every victim who had been silenced, she would stand her ground. The battle wasn't just for her. It was for something greater. The night was far from over, and the lessons the Iron Vultures were about to learn would be ones they'd never forget. The Iron Curtain falls. The silence that followed Michelle's swift takedown of the gang member was deafening. For the first time that night, the Iron Vultures hesitated. Their collective bravado faltered as their fallen comrade writhed on the ground, clutching his twisted arm. The man's pained groans echoed through the stillness, but Michelle's unwavering gaze remained fixed on the gang's leader, Crusher. He was seething, his chest heaving as he struggled to maintain the upper hand. Michelle could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes, though he quickly masked it with a sneer. Crusher wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he'd dismissed as an easy target. That she was a woman, and a black woman at that, only fueled his bruised ego. Crusher's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Get up," he barked at his fallen comrade. The man tried to rise, but his injured leg buckled beneath him, and he collapsed again with a grimace. Crusher scowled, the veins in his neck bulging with anger. "You're embarrassing us." Michelle remained motionless, her calm demeanor unnerving the gang. They had expected fear, pleading, or at least hesitation. Instead, she stood before them, her stance steady, her confidence unshaken. She hadn't even broken a sweat. Crusher turned his attention back to Michelle. "You think you're tough because you got a lucky shot in," he snarled, stepping closer. "We're not done here. Not by a long shot." Michelle tilted her head slightly, her gaze unyielding. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "We're not done. But the outcome isn't going to change." Her words stung. Crusher's lips curled into a snarl as he signaled to the others. "Get her," he roared. The gang sprang into action, their movements chaotic but coordinated. Michelle's training took over, her mind and body moving as one. Time seemed to slow as the first man lunged at her, his fists swinging wildly. She ducked under his punch and delivered a sharp elbow to his ribs, sending him stumbling backward. Another came from her left, swinging a tire iron. Michelle sidestepped, her movements fluid, and caught his wrist mid-swing. With a sharp twist, she disarmed him, sending the tire iron clattering to the ground. She followed up with a precise kick to his chest, knocking him off balance. Two more rushed her simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm her with their numbers. Michelle pivoted, using their momentum against them. She grabbed one by the arm and flung him into the other, the impact sending both sprawling onto the gravel. Her military training had instilled in her the importance of efficiency. Every move was calculated, every action deliberate. Crusher watched, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. His gang, his loyal followers, were falling like dominoes. The confidence that had carried them into this confrontation was now crumbling under the weight of their miscalculation. "You're gonna pay for this," one of the gang members shouted, charging at Michelle with a chain. She sidestepped his wild swing and caught the chain midair. With a sharp yank, she pulled him off balance and delivered a spinning kick to his chest, sending him sprawling. The remaining members hesitated, their fear palpable. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying the price. Crusher, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. His pride wouldn't allow it. He reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a switchblade, the steel glinting ominously under the flickering light. "Enough of this," he growled. "Let's see how tough you are when you're bleeding." Michelle's eyes locked onto the blade, her expression unchanging. She knew how to handle armed opponents. Crusher stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate as he tried to intimidate her. "You think you're special," he sneered. "Think you can just walk through my turf and make a fool out of me? Not tonight." Michelle didn't respond. She adjusted her stance, her body poised like a coiled spring. Crusher lunged, the blade slashing through the air. Michelle dodged with precision, her movements almost too fast to follow. She stepped inside his reach, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The blade fell to the ground with a clatter. Before Crusher could react, Michelle delivered a powerful knee strike to his gut, forcing him to stagger backward. He gasped for air, clutching his stomach, but Michelle didn't let up. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the night like steel. "You're done," she said, her tone firm. "Walk away now, or this gets worse." Crusher's face twisted with rage, but the flicker of fear in his eyes was unmistakable. His gang, once an intimidating force, now lay scattered and defeated around him. The confidence that had fueled their actions was gone, replaced by the stark reality of their situation. For a moment, it seemed like Crusher might back down. But then, in a final act of desperation, he lunged at Michelle with his fists raised. She anticipated his move, sidestepping and delivering a swift strike to the side of his head. He crumpled to the ground, his body hitting the gravel with a heavy thud. The night fell silent again, the only sounds the groans of the defeated gang members and the faint hum of crickets. Michelle straightened, her breathing steady as she scanned the scene. She knew this wasn't over. The iron vultures would regroup, and Crusher's ego wouldn't allow him to let this go easily. But for now, the battle was won. Michelle retrieved her duffel bag from the roof of her car and opened it. Inside was her phone, which she used to call the authorities. As she spoke with the dispatcher, her eyes never left the gang. They were still a threat, even in their current state. When she hung up, she turned back to the gang, her voice calm but firm. "The police are on their way. You'll answer for what you've done." Crusher glared at her from the ground, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. But he didn't say a word. He knew he was beaten. Michelle leaned against her car, her stance relaxed but ready. The night had been long, and there was still much to do. But she was prepared for whatever came next. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up against hate, about showing the world that strength wasn't defined by numbers or arrogance. As the distant sound of sirens filled the air, Michelle allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about standing firm in the face of fear. Tonight, she had done just that. And she wasn't done yet. The road ahead was long, but Michelle was ready to face whatever challenges awaited her. The reckoning. The flashing blue and red lights of the approaching police cars cut through the night like a beacon of impending justice. Michelle stood firm, her stance relaxed but vigilant, as the sirens grew louder. Around her, the iron vultures stirred, their defiance now tempered by the stark reality of their predicament. Crusher, still slumped on the ground, glared at Michelle with unfiltered hatred, his arrogance now a flickering shadow of what it had been. As the first squad car screeched to a halt, two officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holsters. Their eyes darted across the scene. The scattered gang members, the fallen weapons, and the solitary figure of Michelle standing tall amidst the chaos. "What's going on here?" one officer demanded, his flashlight cutting through the darkness to land squarely on Crusher. His expression hardened as he recognized the gang leader, whose reputation preceded him. Michelle stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. "These men tried to assault me," she said. "I defended myself and disarmed them. You'll find weapons scattered across the area." The officers exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. It wasn't every day that they encountered a lone woman who had managed to take down an entire gang. But Michelle's composed demeanor and the evidence lying around spoke volumes. "Is that true?" the officer asked, directing his question toward Crusher. Crusher's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he spat. "She's lying. She attacked us for no reason." Michelle didn't flinch. "Check the security cameras," she said, gesturing toward the small gas station. "They'll tell you everything you need to know." The second officer nodded and moved toward the building to access the footage. Meanwhile, Michelle continued to stand her ground, her calm gaze unwavering. The other officer approached her, his tone softening slightly. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. "I'm fine," Michelle replied. "But I'd like to see these men held accountable for what they've done." The officer nodded, impressed by her composure. "We'll sort this out." As the officer turned to address the gang, Crusher's anger boiled over. "You think you're a hero," he growled at Michelle. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Michelle met his glare with steely resolve. "No, Crusher. You're the one who'll regret it. Your reign of terror ends tonight." The officer nearest to Crusher placed a firm hand on his shoulder, forcing him to sit back down. "Enough," he barked. "You're in no position to threaten anyone." Minutes later, the officer who had gone to check the security footage returned, his expression grim. "It's all on tape," he said to his partner. "She's telling the truth." These guys surrounded her and escalated things. The first officer sighed and nodded. "All right," he said, pulling out his handcuffs. "You're all under arrest. Weapons charges, assault, and intimidation. We'll sort the rest out at the station." As the officers began cuffing the gang members, Michelle watched silently. Crusher fought against his restraints, spewing curses and threats, but his words carried no weight anymore. One by one, the gang members were loaded into the waiting squad cars, their bravado replaced by sullen silence. When the last of them was secured, one of the officers turned back to Michelle. "You're free to go, Mom," he said, "but if you'd like to press charges, we'll need your statement." Michelle nodded. "I'll come to the station in the morning. Right now, I just want to get back on the road." The officer extended a hand, a gesture of respect. "You handled yourself well out here. Not many people could have stood up to them like that." Michelle shook his hand, her grip firm. "Thank you, officer. But this wasn't just about me. It's about standing up to people like them." With that, Michelle climbed into her car and started the engine. The sound of the sirens began to fade as the squad cars drove off, leaving the gas station quiet once more. But the night wasn't over for Michelle. As she pulled back onto the highway, her thoughts turned inward. The road stretched out before her, illuminated only by the glow of her headlights. Michelle's grip on the steering wheel was steady, but her mind was a storm of emotions. The adrenaline from the confrontation had begun to wear off, leaving behind a familiar weight, a mix of anger, frustration, and sorrow. She thought of her father, of the countless nights he had spent on roads like this, traveling from town to town to fight for justice. He had faced threats, violence, and hatred, yet he had never wavered. His courage had been his greatest weapon, and Michelle had inherited that strength. But tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The Iron Vultures were just one group of many. Hate, in all its forms, was a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more would take its place. Michelle knew that her actions tonight were just a small victory in a much larger war. But small victories mattered. They were stepping stones toward change, toward a world where people like Crusher no longer held power over others through fear. As the miles passed, Michelle allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought of the young women she taught in her self-defense classes, many of whom had faced their own battles against violence and prejudice. She thought of the lessons she had learned in the military, the discipline and resilience that had shaped her into the person she was today. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a reminder of why she fought. Courage is contagious, Michelle. When one person stands up, it inspires others to do the same. The memory brought a faint smile to her lips. Her father had been right. Courage was contagious. And tonight, she hoped her actions would inspire others to find their own strength. Hours later, Michelle pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside motel. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. She parked her car and stepped out, her body aching from the night's events. But as she walked toward the motel's entrance, her stride remained confident. Inside, the receptionist greeted her with a warm smile, oblivious to the ordeal Michelle had just endured. She checked in quickly and made her way to her room, the key jingling softly in her hand. Once inside, Michelle set her duffel bag on the bed and sat down, her shoulders finally relaxing. The room was small and unremarkable, but it was a sanctuary for the night. She leaned back, closing her eyes as the weight of the day settled over her. Tomorrow, she would give her statement to the police. Tomorrow, she would continue her journey to honor her father's legacy. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The road was long, and the fight was far from over. But Michelle was ready for whatever lay ahead. As she drifted off to sleep, the faint sound of motorcycles echoed in her mind, a reminder of the battle she had won and the battles still to come. Shadows of the past. Morning light spilled through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting soft, golden rays across the worn carpet. Michelle stirred, blinking against the brightness, her body heavy from the previous night's events. The echoes of engines and taunts still lingered in her mind, but she pushed them aside, grounding herself in the present. Today, she had a mission, one that required her to revisit a painful yet formative chapter of her life. After a quick shower and a change into a crisp white blouse and sturdy jeans, Michelle left the motel. Her duffel bag rested in the passenger seat as she navigated the winding roads toward the small town of Winfield. It was there, decades ago, that her father had fought one of his most harrowing battles for civil rights. The town, steeped in history, had been both a battleground and a beacon of hope. The journey was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of her car's engine. Michelle's thoughts drifted back to her father, William Thompson. He had been a man of unshakable conviction, a towering figure who had marched in protests, faced hostile crowds, and spoken at rallies that drew both supporters and detractors. His life had been a testament to resilience, and he had instilled those values in his daughter from a young age. Michelle's earliest memory of her father was of him standing in their modest living room, his voice steady as he explained why he had to leave for yet another protest. "Courage isn't just about standing tall, Michelle," he had said, crouching to meet her gaze. "It's about standing for what's right, even when it's hard." As the town of Winfield came into view, Michelle felt a mix of nostalgia and unease. The streets were lined with historic brick buildings, their facades weathered but proud. She parked near the courthouse, a towering structure that had once been the site of tense standoffs between civil rights activists and local authorities. It was here that her father had been arrested during a peaceful sit-in. His image splashed across local newspapers as a symbol of defiance. Michelle stepped out of her car, her boots clicking against the pavement as she made her way toward the courthouse steps. She paused, her eyes tracing the path her father had walked so many years ago. The memories were vivid, despite her young age at the time. She remembered clutching her mother's hand as they watched him being led away in handcuffs, his head held high. Today, the courthouse was quieter, its imposing columns casting long shadows across the square. But Michelle knew that the town's history of racial tension hadn't been erased. It had merely been buried under layers of progress and silence. She could still feel it in the wary glances of some passers-by, in the hesitant smiles of others. Her first stop was the Winfield Historical Society, a small museum dedicated to preserving the town's history. Inside, the air was cool and slightly musty, the walls lined with photographs and artifacts that told the story of Winfield's past. Michelle's eyes were immediately drawn to a black and white photograph of her father, displayed prominently in the civil rights section. He stood at the center of a group of protesters, his expression resolute, his fist raised in defiance. "Remarkable man," a voice said behind her. Michelle turned to see an older woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She wore a name tag that read Margaret Hensley, curator. "He was my father," Michelle replied, her voice tinged with pride and sadness. Margaret's smile widened. "I remember him well. He changed this town in ways most people couldn't have imagined. He made us confront our own ugliness and strive to be better." Michelle nodded, her gaze returning to the photograph. "He paid a high price for it." Margaret's expression turned somber. "Yes, he did. But his courage inspired so many, including myself. He showed us that change doesn't come without sacrifice." The two women spoke for a while longer, sharing memories and reflections on the progress the town had made and the work that still remained. Margaret eventually guided Michelle to a private archive room, where she had gathered some of William Thompson's personal papers and letters. These were donated to the Historical Society after his passing, Margaret explained. "I thought you might like to see them." Michelle carefully sifted through the documents, her fingers tracing the faded ink of her father's handwriting. Each letter was a window into his thoughts, his hopes, and his fears. One in particular caught her attention, a letter addressed to her, written shortly before his death. "Dear Michelle, if you're reading this, it means I've left this world. But don't let my absence weigh you down. Instead, let it fuel your fire. You've always been strong, stronger than I ever was. I see it in the way you carry yourself, in the way you stand up for what's right. The road you walk will never be easy. There will be times when you'll feel like giving up, times when the world's hatred and ignorance will seem insurmountable. But remember this, every step you take, every battle you fight, matters. You are a part of something greater than yourself. Never let fear silence you. Never let hate define you. And always, always remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the determination to act despite it. I love you, Michelle. And I am so proud of you. With all my heart, Dad." Tears welled in Michelle's eyes as she read the letter, her father's voice echoing in her mind. It was as if he were standing beside her, offering his guidance and strength. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope, her resolve solidifying. Her father's legacy wasn't just a memory, it was a call to action. He had fought for a better world, and now it was her turn to carry that fight forward. Later that afternoon, Michelle visited the site of her father's most significant protest, a park that had been renamed in his honor. The William Thompson Memorial Park was a serene space, its centerpiece a bronze statue of her father standing tall, his arm outstretched in a gesture of hope. Michelle approached the statue, her heart heavy yet full. She stood there for a long time, reflecting on the man who had shaped her life and the battles he had fought. She thought of the iron vultures and the countless others like them, of the hatred that still festered in the world. But she also thought of the progress that had been made, of the people who had been inspired by her father's courage. She thought of the strength she had found within herself, of the lessons she had learned from him. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Michelle made a silent promise. She would continue her journey, not just to honor her father, but to ensure that his fight for justice and equality would never be forgotten. She turned and walked away, her steps purposeful, her spirit unyielding. The road ahead was long, but Michelle was ready to face it head-on. Echoes of resilience. The sun hummed low in the sky, casting an amber glow over the town of Winfield as Michelle pulled her car onto the highway, leaving behind the memories of her father's struggles and triumphs. Her time in the town had been both grounding and galvanizing. The weight of history pressed firmly on her shoulders, but it also gave her a sense of direction. She wasn't just continuing her father's legacy, she was forging her own path. As the miles rolled by, Michelle's thoughts drifted back to the events of the previous night. The confrontation with the iron vultures had stirred something deep within her, not fear, but a burning resolve. She had faced hatred head-on and emerged unbroken, a testament to the resilience instilled in her by her upbringing and her time in the military. Yet, she knew the fight was far from over. Hate, after all, was not confined to a single night or a single group. The hum of the road was soothing, a stark contrast to the chaos of the gas station. Michelle tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her mind replaying every detail of the encounter. The jeers, the threats, the moment Crusher pulled his blade. It was all seared into her memory. But more than that, she remembered the look in their eyes when they realized they had underestimated her. That moment of reckoning, when arrogance gave way to fear, was a victory she carried with her. As dusk turned to night, Michelle decided to stop at a roadside diner, its neon sign flickering weakly against the darkening sky. She parked her car and stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The interior was quaint, with checkered floors and red vinyl booths. A few patrons sat scattered around the room, their conversations a low hum that filled the space. Michelle chose a corner booth, her back to the wall, a habit ingrained from years of vigilance. A waitress approached, her smile warm but cautious. "What can I get you, hon?" "Just coffee, please," Michelle replied, her voice steady. The waitress nodded and disappeared behind the counter. Michelle leaned back in her seat, her eyes scanning the room. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, but old habits died hard. Her gaze landed on a table near the window, where a young woman sat with a child, their laughter a bright contrast to the diner's muted ambience. The sight brought a faint smile to Michelle's lips. Her coffee arrived, the waitress placing the steaming mug on the table with a practiced ease. Michelle thanked her and took a sip, the bitterness grounding her. As she sat in the relative quiet of the diner, her thoughts turned to the larger battle she was fighting, not just against physical threats, but against the insidious forces of prejudice and ignorance. Halfway through her coffee, Michelle's phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket and saw a notification from a news app. The headline read, "Notorious Iron Vultures Gang Arrested After Failed Assault." She tapped the article, her heart pounding slightly as she read the details. The article recounted the events at the gas station, though it omitted Michelle's name. It described the gang's history of intimidation and violence, and detailed how their latest escapade had ended in their arrest. Local law enforcement credited a courageous bystander for thwarting the gang's attack. Michelle felt a mix of emotions as she read. She was glad the Iron Vultures had been stopped, but she knew this was only a small victory. Groups like theirs were symptoms of a deeper sickness, one that couldn't be cured with arrests alone. It required education, empathy, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. She scrolled to the comments section, hesitant but curious. As expected, the responses were polarizing. Some praised the anonymous bystander for their bravery, while others spewed vitriol, defending the gang or downplaying their actions. One comment, however, stood out. "This is why we need more people like them, people who don't back down in the face of hate." Michelle stared at the words, her resolve strengthening. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were others out there, standing up for what was right, refusing to let hate dictate their lives. It was a reminder that change, though slow and often painful, was possible. The bell above the diner's door jingled, pulling Michelle from her thoughts. A man entered, his leather jacket and rugged appearance catching her attention. For a brief moment, her instincts flared, but as he approached the counter and ordered a coffee, she realized he wasn't a threat. Still, her heightened awareness reminded her of the vigilance required to navigate a world where danger could lurk anywhere. Michelle finished her coffee and paid her bill, leaving a generous tip for the waitress. As she stepped outside, the cool night air greeted her, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. She leaned against her car for a moment, gazing up at the stars scattered across the sky. They were a reminder of her father's words. No matter how dark it gets, there's always light. You just have to look for it. Back on the road, Michelle felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her destination tonight was a nearby city where she had scheduled a self-defense workshop at a community center. The workshop was part of a program she had started to empower women and marginalized communities, teaching them the skills they needed to protect themselves both physically and mentally. When she arrived, the center was abuzz with activity. Dozens of women, ranging in age from teenagers to seniors, had gathered in the large gymnasium. Michelle was greeted by the program's coordinator, a petite woman named Carla who radiated warmth and enthusiasm. "Michelle, it's so good to see you," Carla said, embracing her. "Everyone's been looking forward to this." Michelle smiled. "I'm glad to be here. Let's get started." For the next 2 hours, Michelle led the group through a series of drills, teaching them how to assess their surroundings, recognize potential threats, and defend themselves if necessary. She emphasized the importance of confidence and awareness, encouraging each participant to trust their instincts. As the session ended, the room buzzed with energy. Women shared stories of their own experiences, their voices filled with a mix of pain and determination. Michelle listened, offering words of encouragement and advice. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing she had made a difference, even if only for a few people. One woman approached her as the group began to disperse. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with a shy demeanor and a hesitant smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "I've always been scared of standing up for myself, but tonight, you made me feel like I could." Michelle placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You can," she said. "Never let anyone make you feel powerless. You're stronger than you know." The young woman nodded, her smile growing. "I'll remember that." As Michelle left the center, she felt a profound sense of purpose. The fight against hate and violence wasn't just about grand gestures or public victories. It was about these moments, empowering individuals, fostering resilience, and planting seeds of change. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but Michelle was ready. With every mile she drove, every workshop she taught, and every person she inspired, she carried her father's legacy forward, weaving her own story into the tapestry of justice and hope. Legacy of courage. The city skyline glittered in the distance as Michelle navigated the winding road back toward the highway. The quiet hum of the engine accompanied her thoughts, which were heavy with both reflection and anticipation. Her journey, though far from over, was now undeniably intertwined with the people she had met and the lives she had touched. Every step forward felt like a ripple in a much larger pond, a ripple she hoped would someday become a wave of change. The self-defense workshop had left her with a deep sense of fulfillment, but also a bittersweet awareness of the challenges faced by so many. The young woman's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "You made me feel like I could." That single sentence carried an entire world of meaning, reminding Michelle that empowerment wasn't just about teaching skills, it was about igniting belief. As the hours stretched on, the open road became a canvas for Michelle's memories. Her mind wandered to her father, to the man who had taught her that courage was as much about perseverance as it was about bravery. His lessons had always been steeped in a quiet wisdom, delivered not with force, but with the kind of conviction that made even the most daunting challenges seem surmountable. One memory stood out above the rest. She had been no more than 8 years old, sitting on the porch with her father as the sun set behind their small house. A group of angry men had driven by earlier, their shouts and slurs directed at her father, who had recently led a protest in the neighboring town. Michelle had been scared, but her father had remained calm. "They're loud because they're afraid," he had said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Fear makes people do ugly things, but we don't respond with fear, Michelle. We respond with strength and love." That night, he had taken her hands in his and taught her her first self-defense move, not as a means to incite violence, but as a way to protect herself if the world's ugliness ever reached her. "You have to be prepared," he had said, "but never let anger guide your actions. Strength without purpose is wasted." The highway stretched endlessly before her, the vast expanse of asphalt illuminated by the soft glow of her headlights. Michelle's thoughts were interrupted by the familiar hum of motorcycles in the distance. Her muscles tensed instinctively, her hand tightening around the steering wheel. She glanced in her rearview mirror, scanning the darkness for the source of the sound. Moments later, a small group of riders came into view, their headlights piercing through the night. Michelle's heartbeat quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. Not every group of bikers was a threat, she reminded herself. Still, her instincts sharpened as they drew closer. The riders sped past her car, their engines roaring like thunder. They didn't slow or acknowledge her presence, disappearing into the horizon as quickly as they had appeared. Michelle exhaled slowly, her grip on the wheel relaxing. The encounter served as a reminder of the unpredictable nature of the road, and the vigilance required to navigate it. By the time Michelle reached her next stop, the sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon in hues of pink and gold. She pulled into the parking lot of a small church nestled at the edge of a quiet town. The building was modest but welcoming, its stained glass windows glowing softly in the early morning light. Inside, a group of community leaders had gathered to discuss an upcoming event focused on racial justice and community healing. Michelle had been invited to speak, her reputation as a self-defense instructor and advocate for marginalized communities preceding her. She stepped into the room, her presence commanding yet approachable. The meeting began with introductions and updates on the event's planning. Michelle listened intently, her mind already crafting the message she wanted to deliver. When it was her turn to speak, she stood, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I'm honored to be here," she began, her voice steady and heartfelt. "This event is about more than just awareness. It's about action. It's about giving people the tools they need to stand up against hate, whether that's through education, advocacy, or self-defense. And it's about creating spaces where everyone feels safe and valued." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "I've learned that courage isn't something we're born with, it's something we cultivate. It grows when we stand together, when we support one another, and when we refuse to let fear or hatred dictate our lives. My father taught me that. He showed me that the fight for justice isn't won in a single moment or by a single person. It's a collective effort, a legacy we carry forward together." The room was silent, the weight of her words palpable. One of the organizers, an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes, nodded thoughtfully. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. "And we're proud to have you here." Michelle smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and determination. "Thank you. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us, and what we're willing to do to create a better world." After the meeting, Michelle lingered outside the church, watching as the sun rose higher in the sky. The warmth of its rays felt like an embrace, a reminder of the light her father had always spoken of. She thought about the people she had met on her journey, from the women at her workshops to the community leaders she had just spoken with. Each encounter had reaffirmed her belief in the power of unity and resilience. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Carla, the coordinator of the workshop she had led the previous night. Just wanted to let you know. The young woman you spoke with stayed after and shared her story with us. She said your words gave her the courage to face her fears. Thank you for being the light she needed. Michelle's eyes filled with tears as she read the message. She thought of her father again, his voice echoing in her mind. Every step you take matters, Michelle. Even the small ones. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, her resolve stronger than ever. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but Michelle knew she wasn't walking it alone. She was part of something greater, a movement rooted in courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that change was possible. As she climbed back into her car and started the engine, Michelle felt a sense of peace. The battles she faced were daunting, but she carried with her the lessons of the past, the strength of her father's legacy, and the hope of a brighter future. With the rising sun as her guide, she drove forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. A new horizon. Michelle drove on, the road stretching endlessly before her, each mile a quiet testament to her journey. The sun now hung high in the sky, its golden rays warming the land as she approached the outskirts of another small town. This one had a familiar feel, a mix of charm and history, where the past whispered through every brick and the future lingered in the cautious hope of its residents. She parked outside a modest community center where a mural adorned the wall. The vibrant artwork depicted a montage of faces, diverse, determined, and full of life. The words beneath the painting read, "Together we rise." The center's director, an energetic woman named Priya, greeted Michelle with an enthusiastic hug. "You're here. I can't tell you how much it means to us," she said, her voice brimming with warmth. Michelle smiled. "I'm glad to be here. What's the plan?" Priya gestured toward the bustling gymnasium behind her. "It's a community gathering, workshops, speeches, and a lot of sharing. People are excited to hear your story." Michelle nodded, feeling a familiar blend of anticipation and purpose. This was why she had embarked on this journey, to connect, to inspire, and to learn. Inside, the gym was alive with energy. Tables lined the walls, each representing local organizations and initiatives aimed at fostering equality and empowerment. Families milled about, children ran laughing between clusters of adults, and a steady hum of conversation filled the air. Michelle moved through the crowd, her presence drawing respectful nods and quiet words of gratitude. When it was time for her to speak, the room grew quiet. Michelle took the stage, her gaze sweeping over the audience. She felt the weight of their expectations, but also their trust. Taking a deep breath, she began. "I want to start by saying how humble I am to stand here today," she said, her voice steady. "Each of you represents the heart of this fight, the fight for justice, for equality, for the right to live without fear." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "I didn't always know where my path would lead. I grew up watching my father fight battles that seemed impossible to win. He faced hatred and violence, but he never gave up. He believed that change was possible, even when the odds were stacked against him." Michelle shared stories of her father's activism, her own experiences in the military, and the lessons she had learned from her recent encounters. She spoke of the iron vultures, not to glorify the violence, but to highlight the importance of preparation, resilience, and standing firm in the face of hate. Her voice grew stronger as she addressed the heart of her message. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen alone. It happens when we stand together, when we lift each other up, and when we refuse to let fear dictate our actions. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about choosing to act, even when you're scared. The room erupted into applause, the sound a powerful affirmation of her words. As Michelle stepped down from the stage, she was met with handshakes, hugs, and heartfelt thanks. One older man, his weathered face lined with emotion, clasped her hand tightly. "You've given us hope," he said simply, "and we'll carry that forward." The rest of the day was filled with connection and collaboration. Michelle participated in discussions, led a brief self-defense demonstration, and listened to the stories of those around her. Each conversation reaffirmed her belief in the power of community and the importance of shared strength. As evening fell, Priya approached her with a small box wrapped in a ribbon. "This is for you," she said, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. Michelle opened it to find a framed photograph of the mural outside, with the words, "Together we rise," inscribed beneath. Her heart swelled as she traced the image with her fingers. "Thank you," she said softly. "This means more than I can say." Later, as Michelle drove away from the center, the stars began to dot the sky. The mural's message lingered in her mind, a beacon of hope guiding her forward. She thought of her father, of the people she had met, and of the lives she hoped to impact. Her journey wasn't just about honoring the past, it was about shaping the future. She pulled onto a quiet overlook and stepped out of her car, the night air cool against her skin. Gazing out at the horizon, she felt a profound sense of peace. The battles she had faced were part of a larger story, one that spanned generations. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly hold more challenges, Michelle was ready to meet them. The stars above seemed to whisper their own message, a quiet reminder of her father's words. "No matter how dark it gets, there's always light. You just have to look for it." Michelle smiled, her resolve as bright as the constellations. She climbed back into her car and turned the key, the engine roaring to life. The road stretched out before her, endless and full of promise. With her father's legacy as her compass and her own courage as her guide, she drove on, toward a future where strength, love, and justice would always prevail. And in that moment, Michelle Thompson knew the fight was worth it. Always.